I thought I had the kind of life people envied, a loving wife, a beautiful daughter, and a quiet home. But then the silence started speaking louder than words. And one day, everything I believed about my life unraveled. What came next wasn't revenge. It was something harder, rebuilding from the ruins she left behind. The house always smelled faintly of rosemary and citrus, Corinne's doing, of course. Harlan Vexley had never cared much for scented oils or curated atmospheres, but now, even that smell unsettled him. It wasn't just the fragrance. It was everything. Small details that didn't make sense when viewed alone, but together formed a quiet storm of doubt in his mind. They had been married for 9 years. The kind of marriage that, to others, seemed polished and dependable. They had a daughter, Unia, who was the heart of their little world, bright, imaginative, just about to start school in September. On the surface, life looked predictable. Safe. But underneath, something subtle had shifted, like a tide pulling gently in the wrong direction. It started with changes in routine. Corinne was leaving the house earlier, returning later. She attributed it to work, a new project, a demanding client. Harlan wanted to believe her. He needed to. But the numbers never quite added up. He wasn't the type to snoop, but he noticed things, how she started locking her phone, how she smiled too vaguely when explaining where she'd been. At first, he rationalized it. Everyone had bad weeks. Stress, exhaustion, disconnection, these things came and went. But the feeling lingered. It wasn't the absence of affection that alarmed him. It was the absence of presence. She was there, but not really. Her body moved through their home, her voice responded when spoken to, but her eyes rarely met his anymore. One Saturday, she came home with a new dress, something dark green, sleek, not her usual style. She mentioned a boutique downtown. But when he looked at the tag later, it had a different store's name. One she hadn't mentioned in years. A small thing, maybe, but it stuck with him. There was also the way Unia had started asking strange questions. One night, she asked if Mommy was mad at Daddy. Another time, she asked why they didn't eat together anymore. Harlan didn't know how to answer. The truth was, he didn't know what was happening. He only knew that he felt it, in his gut, in the hollow of his chest, in the strange silence that filled their once vibrant home. He began to sleep less. Often, he found himself awake at 2 or 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling while Corinne lay beside him, her back turned. He'd count the ceiling panels, listen to the rhythm of her breathing, and wonder where her mind was. Not once did she reach for him in those nights. Not once did she ask if he was okay. One evening, as he gathered laundry, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. He didn't touch it, wouldn't allow himself that line to be crossed, but he saw the name flash across the screen. A name he didn't recognize. A name she had never spoken aloud. The message preview was nothing unusual, something about, next time, and same place. But the tone, casual, intimate, made his stomach twist. Still, he said nothing. The next morning, he went through the motions, breakfast, dishes, packing Unia's school things. Corinne left early again. She kissed their daughter on the forehead and offered Harlan a quick nod, not a word. That was when he decided to make an appointment he had been postponing, a routine checkup with a new physician, Dr. Idris Kelm. He had been feeling low on energy, distracted, foggy. It was probably stress, he told himself. But something in him whispered otherwise. The appointment came and went. Dr. Kelm was calm, efficient, asked questions that felt routine at first but grew more specific. Blood work. Further testing. A follow-up scheduled sooner than expected. When the results came in, Harlan sat alone in a quiet office as the doctor's words blurred into one echoing phrase. We caught it early. What it was, they never named it precisely in that moment. But Harlan understood enough to feel the weight of it settle across his shoulders. He left the clinic without speaking to anyone. Drove the long way home, through streets he didn't usually take, past unfamiliar neighborhoods. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, he parked in front of his house and sat in the car for a while, gripping the steering wheel like it might anchor him to something solid. He didn't cry. He didn't call anyone. He just sat there, breathing slowly, trying to understand how everything he believed about his life had begun to dissolve without warning. Something was off. It had been off for a while. And now, it wasn't just a feeling. It was a fact. Harlan had always believed that silence could be useful, a space to think, to process, to find clarity. But lately it felt like it was closing in on him. The quiet in the house had become louder than any argument. Every chair scraped on the floor echoed. Every drawer open seemed to hold weight. And every conversation with Corinne had become a carefully curated performance, scripted and short. He didn't confront her. Something inside him resisted the instinct to accuse. Maybe it was fear. Maybe dignity. Maybe the need to be certain before he set something irreversible into motion. So, instead, he waited. Observed. Lived inside the stillness, where her absence became more visible than her presence. Corinne's patterns became less predictable. Some nights, she came home later than usual, offering vague excuses about work dinners and last-minute meetings. Harlan nodded, smiled even, and poured her a glass of water. She rarely finished it. She barely touched the meals he made. Her phone was never out of reach, her messages typed quickly, screen angled away from view. He didn't need to see what was on it. He already knew. But knowing wasn't the same as understanding. He turned inward, found comfort in small things, folding Unia's clothes, washing dishes by hand, organizing the bookshelf alphabetically. Every task, no matter how mundane, gave him structure. Something real, something that didn't lie or evade or hide in shadows. Rowan Kepler, his longtime friend and occasional business collaborator, noticed the shift before anyone else. They met for coffee one afternoon at a quiet place near the university district, and Rowan asked, without much preamble, if everything at home was okay. Harlan didn't answer. Not really. Just offered a small shrug, said he was tired. Rowan didn't push, but the concern lingered in his eyes. It was during one of those sleepless nights that Harlan found himself walking the neighborhood in silence. The streets were nearly empty, streetlights casting soft halos on the pavement. He passed homes with lights still on, families still awake, voices murmuring behind closed windows. It felt like another world, one he used to belong to, but now only observed from the outside. He thought about Corinne, where she was when she wasn't home, who she was when she wasn't with him. And more than that, he thought about the space between them. A space that used to be filled with laughter, shared plans, even arguments. Now, it held nothing but careful nods and brief exchanges about schedules and groceries. A week after the visit to Dr. Kelm, Harlan returned for the follow-up. The waiting room was empty, cold with recycled air and faint antiseptic. The doctor greeted him with the kind of practiced calm that immediately made Harlan nervous. He listened quietly as Dr. Kelm explained the results. A chronic condition. Not life-threatening, but serious enough to require treatment. Something that likely didn't develop in isolation. Harlan nodded, thanked him, asked a few questions. The drive home was slow. He barely registered the streets. The diagnosis didn't shock him. What shook him was the implication that the boundaries of his life had been crossed without his consent. That trust, once fractured, could leave scars deeper than betrayal. That night, Corinne returned home late again. She moved through the kitchen, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat across from him at the dining table. They spoke about Unia's school project, about weather, about nothing at all. Harlan watched her, listened to her voice, but didn't hear it. It was background noise now, a soundtrack to a life that no longer felt like his. He didn't mention the diagnosis. Not yet. Not until he figured out what he wanted to do with it. Telling her would open a door he wasn't ready to walk through. And he wasn't sure what lay on the other side. Later, after Corinne went to bed, Harlan sat alone in the living room, surrounded by quiet. The walls, once filled with warmth and conversation, now felt hollow. He stared at the framed photographs on the mantel, smiling faces, vacations, birthdays, moments that felt real once. He wondered how many of those smiles were genuine, and how many were already cracked by secrets. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was a space filled with answers he didn't want, questions he couldn't ask, and a growing sense that the truth was already written, just not yet spoken aloud. He leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, allowed himself to feel the full weight of it. Not rage. Not grief. Just the quiet ache of realization. Something had been broken. And it wasn't going to fix itself. The morning after the doctor's visit, Harlan stood in front of the mirror for longer than usual. He didn't recognize the man staring back. His face looked the same, the slight lines near the eyes, the familiar scar by his chin, the tired hollows just beneath. But something beneath the surface had shifted. He was no longer asking what was happening. Now he knew. And knowing changed everything. Corinne moved through the house like a breeze, present, but untouchable. Their routines were intact, but everything felt mechanical. Breakfasts were quiet. Goodbyes were short. Even Unia had stopped asking why her parents didn't sit together on the couch anymore. Harlan didn't confront Corinne, didn't demand confessions. He no longer needed them. The truth lived in her distance, in the growing pile of excuses, in the late-night texts she typed just out of his view. Instead, he began to reclaim control, not through shouting, but through quiet decisions. He scheduled another meeting with Dr. Kelm to begin treatment. He reached out to a legal contact, Marla Denwin, someone he had worked with years ago. The message was short, professional. He didn't mention Corinne's name, nor what had happened. Just that he needed guidance. Options. Clarity. Then he sat down and wrote a letter to himself. Not a journal. Not a dramatic outpouring. Just a few sentences, printed on plain paper, folded and kept in his desk drawer. It read, "You are allowed to begin again. Not because it's easy, but because you survived the part that wasn't." He told no one. Instead, he began preparing in silence. He separated his accounts. Changed the passwords he hadn't thought about in years. Moved a few things to a small storage unit across town, just a box or two, nothing obvious. He wasn't hiding. He was shifting. Gradually. Deliberately. So that when it was time, he could walk away without burning everything to the ground. His days became full of small tasks, organizing Unia's schedule, checking in with Rowan more often, researching treatment options. He kept busy, but not to escape, to rebuild. Each action stitched together the person he was becoming. Not someone vengeful. Not someone broken. Just someone moving forward. Corinne noticed. She didn't ask questions, but she watched him differently, a flicker of unease in her gaze when he mentioned legal calls, or when he stepped out without explaining where he was going. Perhaps she sensed the shift. Perhaps she knew the silence she had fostered was now speaking back to her, not in words, but in calm departure. One evening, Unia fell asleep in his arms while he read her favorite book for the third time. He stayed there for a while, listening to her breath, holding on to the one part of his life that still felt pure. She was his reason, not for staying, but for leaving the right way. The next day, he walked past the bedroom where Corinne sat scrolling through her phone. She didn't look up. And he realized, he wasn't angry anymore. He didn't want revenge. He wanted distance. He wanted peace. And he was finally willing to fight for it, not with accusations, but with decisions. Later that week, Marla called. They spoke quietly, privately. She offered advice, listed the options, explained the implications. Harlan took notes. Asked questions. At the end of the call, he thanked her. Not because he felt relief, but because he felt ready. He started sleeping again, not much, but enough. He cooked more often, sometimes just for himself. He played Unia's favorite songs in the car and sang along. He didn't feel healed. But he felt present. That was enough. The pain was still there. But it was no longer the kind that paralyzed him. Now, it pushed him gently, toward a version of life that didn't require pretending, toward a future that didn't include the person who had left him long before he decided to leave her. He didn't break. He rebuilt. Autumn arrived almost unnoticed, the way change often does. One morning, the air was cooler, the light sharper, and the leaves along the sidewalk had begun to dry and curl. Harlan Vexley stood at the kitchen window, watching the trees shift color, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. He wasn't sure when the season had turned, only that he had turned with it. The papers had been filed. Quietly. Cleanly. Marla Denwin had walked him through the process step by step, her voice calm and exact. There were no dramatic confrontations. No raised voices. Corinne had barely reacted when the envelope was handed to her. She simply looked at it, nodded once, and placed it face down on the counter. After that, they barely spoke. They still shared the house, for now. For Unia's sake, for logistical simplicity. But everything had become a ritual of avoidance. Separate meals. Separate mornings. Separate worlds under one roof. The space between them wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Emotional. A growing distance that neither of them tried to close. Corinne didn't apologize. She didn't deny. She didn't fight. That, somehow, made it easier, and harder. There was no chaos to distract from the loss. Just silence and acknowledgement. The absence of love sitting plainly between them like something they had both grown used to carrying. One night, after putting Unia to bed, Harlan walked out to the back porch. The sky was cloudless, and the stars hung low and clear. He sat there for a long time, arms resting on his knees, breathing in the cold. He felt the chill in his chest more than in his skin. But it wasn't pain anymore. It was space. Room. Something new forming where the hurt had lived. The following week, he moved into a small apartment just a few blocks away. Nothing fancy. Just enough. A modest living room, a quiet kitchen, a bedroom with light in the mornings. He brought only what mattered, a few books, Unia's drawings, the photograph of her as a baby that used to hang in his office. He didn't take anything that felt like the past. Only what would belong to the version of himself he was still learning to become. Unia stayed with him on weekends. The first night, she asked if Mommy would come too. He explained gently, without anger, that things would be a little different now. She didn't cry. She just held on to him a little tighter as they read stories, her fingers curled in the fabric of his sleeve. He learned quickly how to fill silence with presence. They made pancakes in the mornings, walked to the park, invented silly games involving leaves and pebbles. And in those quiet, playful moments, he found pieces of himself returning, not as he was before, but as someone lighter, more grounded. Corinne reached out once, a short message asking if he wanted to talk. They met at a neutral cafe. She looked tired, her voice unsure. She spoke of regret, not in the form of an apology, but in the shadowed language of hindsight. He listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't blame. When she asked if there was any chance left, he didn't hesitate. He told her he wished her peace. But they had both left this long before the paperwork had caught up. She didn't argue. They parted quietly. No bitterness. No promises. Back home, he sat at his small desk and opened his drawer. The letter he had written to himself still lay there, folded. He read it again. The words didn't sting anymore. They steadied him. He still had follow-up appointments with Dr. Kelm. The treatment was ongoing, but manageable. His body felt stronger. His mind even more so. Rowan checked in often, offering company without questions. They shared quiet dinners now and then, talked about anything but what had happened. There were still difficult days. Moments when the weight of it all returned, soft but insistent. But now, those moments passed like weather, acknowledged, then allowed to move on. The distance between him and the man he used to be was growing. And for the first time, he didn't want to go back. The first snow came early that year, soft, light, and almost silent. Harlan Vexley stood by the window of his apartment, watching the flakes drift down under the street lamp glow. The world looked clean, untouched, as if it, too, had been given permission to start over. It had been 5 months since he moved out. 5 months of weekends with Unia, slow mornings with coffee, doctor visits that no longer brought dread. His treatment had progressed well. Dr. Kelm was optimistic. His body responded, his strength returned. But it wasn't just the physical that healed. Something deeper had settled, the kind of peace that doesn't come quickly, but only after enough breaking to know what truly matters. He had started writing again, not professionally, not for anyone else. Just for himself. Pages filled with thoughts, fragments, quiet reflections. He didn't call it journaling. It felt more like translation, finding words for things that had lived too long unnamed. Unia had adjusted to the new rhythm of life. She came to his place with a bag full of toys and stories, filling the space with movement and wonder. They painted together, made pancakes with blueberries, created paper animals that lined the windowsill like a quiet parade. She laughed often. And Harlan laughed with her, not because everything was perfect, but because they were present. Corinne had taken her own path. She moved to a smaller home across town, took a leave from work, started therapy. They spoke occasionally, short updates, co-parenting plans. There was no war between them now. Just distance, soft-edged, respectful. She seemed less guarded these days. Less brittle. And for that, he was grateful. Rowan remained a steady presence, not intrusive, just there when needed. They met for hikes, shared long silences, sat through movies neither cared much about. It wasn't about distraction. It was about quiet companionship, a space where Harlan could breathe without explanation. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, Harlan found the letter he had written to himself months ago. He unfolded it slowly, rereading the lines with a kind of reverence. The man who wrote those words had been afraid, uncertain, holding himself together with hope and nothing more. The man reading them now felt something else, not triumph, not even pride, but grounding. He placed the letter back, folded neatly, and smiled. A few weeks later, he stood in front of a small room filled with chairs and strangers. It was the first meeting of a quiet support circle he had helped create, a space for men who had gone through betrayal, emotional loss, and identity collapse. Not therapy. Just stories. Listening. Holding space. He shared his own story carefully. Not all the details. Just the arc, the fall, the stillness, the rebuilding. When he finished, there was no applause. Just nods. A stillness that meant something had landed. And that was enough. Later that night, he walked home through streets covered in thin snow, the air crisp, his coat buttoned tight. He paused under a tree, looked up at the branches outlined in frost, and let himself feel everything, the grief, the growth, the quiet gratitude for pain that had not destroyed, but reshaped. He hadn't planned this life. Hadn't imagined himself living alone, parenting from 2 homes, recovering from something unspoken. But the life he now had, the peace he had earned, felt honest. Real. Enough. At home, Unia's drawings still lined the wall. One of them showed 3 stick figures, a girl in yellow, a man in blue, and a red house behind them. No labels. Just a sun in the corner, and a big green heart in the sky. He stared at it for a long time, then turned off the light, sat by the window, and watched the snow fall quietly on a world that had given him a second chance.